Welcome back to the Chasing Happiness podcast, an honest podcast about finding happiness, what it really means, and the process of getting there. My name is Crystal, and today I have two special guests on the podcast. Today I'm going to be chatting with Dr. Brodkin, an associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the founder and director of the Adult Autism Spectrum Program at the University of Pennsylvania Medicine and has been honored by the Philadelphia Magazine as one of the top doctors in the region for the last 15 years. He is joined with his researcher, Ashley Palatra. She's a clinical researcher and therapist who is currently working on her PhD in psychology at the Catholic University of America in Washington. These two are best-selling authors of the book Missing Each Other: How to Cultivate Meaningful Connections. And we are going to chat all about their research, the book, and why connections are so important. We had a fabulous conversation. Ashley, Ted, or Dr. Brodkin. He did say I could call him Ted, so you will hear me call him that on the podcast. It was a great conversation, and I hope you guys enjoy. So thank you, Ashley and Ted, for both joining me today. If you don't mind taking a minute and just introducing yourselves and what you're doing, and then we'll get chatting about everything else for everyone who's listening to the podcast currently.
Do you want to go first, Ashley?
Sure. Yes. So I am Ashley Palatra. I am a clinical psychology doctoral candidate. So I'm in a PhD program at the moment at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. My clinical work focuses mostly on working with children, adolescents, young adults a little bit in terms of mental health related to anxiety and mood disorders. But previously to that, I was doing a lot of research as well. I mean, still currently, but doing some research with Ted at the University of Pennsylvania. And that's actually where we started working together and met. And a lot of our work together was based on social connection and social functioning in autistic adults. And so that was kind of the space where our relationship started.
Awesome.
And I'm Ted, and I'm an associate professor of psychiatry at University of Pennsylvania. Like Ashley mentioned, I do a lot of research on adult autism and both biological aspects of that, like neurobiology and genetics, but also treatment aspects, and have just had a really long-standing interest in how people connect with each other and get attuned to each other. And so when Ashley and I were working together, that's what led to the idea for this book.
That's amazing. And I'm so excited to talk about the book. And I understand, based on the brief conversation that I had with Ashley before we began, that you guys did all of this research prior to COVID. But I kind of think the book is actually perfectly timed because you just released it this year. And it kind of fits in this weird, strange COVID world that we're living in, because I think connection has become something almost unmanageable in some ways because of technology, because of, as I was explaining to Ashley, here in Southern Ontario, we've had almost 15 months of consecutive lockdowns. So it's been hard to connect with people, to meet people, to form any kind of connection that didn't feel sort of weird in this digital space that we're living in. So I think it's fabulous that you guys have come out with this book. Can you talk a little bit, because you were doing the research prior to COVID, can we start by talking a little bit about how you think this research may change or may be impacted because of COVID, or whether or not you think it's directly correlated, because it has kind of been a strange year and a half?
Yeah, I think, like you said, we really formulated the ideas for the book and started writing it, or really wrote most of it pre-COVID. So I think what we were trying to get at was, what is the essence of human connection? Like what goes into it, and how can we make our connections better? And then along came COVID and sort of maximally challenged all of us, right? With our connections. It's like not enough or too much or some combination there, where we're isolated from other people, or we're stuck in with certain people in our bubble. Which can be wonderful in some ways, or it can be stressful. And then, how do we continue to go about our lives and make new connections, and continue to grow and develop? So it's really been, we definitely did not plan out the timing of it, but we're glad that something came out from our work at a time that hopefully could be really useful. And I'm going to let Ashley talk more about it in a minute, but I think, one of the themes we hit on in the book is kind of this idea of balance and regulation, so that with human connection, we all need human connection at some level. Some of us are more introverted, some are more extroverted, but the vast majority of us need human connection. But there's this process of regulating between getting the connection we need and also getting our own individuality and some space to ourselves. And I think COVID has just distorted all of that, right? It's sort of like in many cases, we're just not getting the connections we need. We're not getting that in-person feedback and all those cues you get in person. But then in other ways, when you're, for some people, just sort of stuck in with one person, one or two people, that can be wearing as well. So I think it's really challenged all of us. And we're hoping that some of the exercises and things we talked about in the book could be helpful.
I'm sure they can. Ashley, did you want to touch on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the only thing I'd add too is, as Ted was talking, is making me think about how when we first started writing this, a lot of our influence came from a lot of the research that was coming out about loneliness and disconnection already pre-COVID. And so how the rates of that were increasing. And, I think generally with advent of all this technology that's just kind of filling our days, it's becoming more and more difficult to pay attention to one another and really be there with one another. It just felt like we write in the book, like two ships passing in the night, sort of when we're trying to just have those conversations. But I think with COVID, it then became a universal experience. In some way, it became a challenge to connect. And so, the timing of it, I mean, I think people have really resonated with it in terms of all having had some challenge with connecting.
I think that's been, in my opinion, that's been sort of one of the blessings in disguise in all of this is worldwide, we are all challenged at this point to make meaningful connections, to build on the connections we were making prior to COVID, but to also maintain the connections we have with the people that maybe we've been locked away with for a year and a half. Because I don't think any of us ever thought we would be in a position where 24/7 we would be stuck with the same people. And realistically, I think that's a challenge for most of us because, as you were saying, Ted, we do, regardless of the kind of person we are, we do still crave alone time and that separate space and, relationships outside of our intimate relationships. And this whole balance, I'm going to call it, has been difficult for the last year. So do you guys want to talk a little bit about the research that you've done and the 4 pillars that you talk about in the book?
Sure. Maybe I'll start, Ashley, this time, and we can switch off. So, the book focuses around something we call attunement, and attunement is an ability to be in touch with yourself, to be aware of yourself, and also to be aware of another person and what's happening between you in the moment, in the flow of the interaction, which is sometimes somewhat predictable, but sometimes unpredictable. So being able to kind of move with that flow of the interaction. And we started talking about this and thinking about this together when we were doing our research on trying to develop an intervention or a program to support adults on the autism spectrum with their social functioning. And the adults that we were working with were doing fairly well in life, many of them. Some of them were in college, some of them were working, some had relationships, but they still had difficulties really connecting. And so as we developed some supports for them and some exercises to help them, we said to each other, I think what we're really trying to teach here is that quality of attunement. So it goes beyond knowing the quote unquote right thing to say in a certain situation, right? Like, so if, pick any situation you want, like checking out at the grocery store or talking to someone at a family event or a funeral or a wedding or whatever. And, you could say, well, the right thing to say in that situation is X, like, say this line. But, and oftentimes those kind of rough guidelines are useful, but because every situation is a little bit different and every person's a little bit different, like, how do you tune into the moment, what's actually happening in this moment with that other person, and meet them and connect with them and say something that really fosters that connection. So we felt like that's what we were really trying to teach. And then the more we thought about it, we thought, this isn't just useful for adults on the autism spectrum. I think that this could really be useful for lots of people, and ourselves included. And we, each of us, I think we started to borrow from the exercises that we were developing and try them out ourselves. And we're like, these are pretty helpful. So that's really how our research kind of started to lead towards this book idea. And maybe I'll let Ashley say a little more.
Yeah. And so from that, it's kind of a big idea, attunement, and it kind of feels hard to define. And so that was one of the goals with the book, of using these pillars to really break it down for people, to help them try and identify what parts of a connection might be more difficult for them over others, because I think not everyone has the same difficulties with connecting with other people. So for us, breaking it down into these 4 pillars, I think we think of them as dynamic and working together all at once, but build off of each other. Felt like an easier way to understand it. So we start with something called relaxed awareness, which is sort of this ability to stay really mindful and aware of yourself and the environment at the same time. So it is a sense of mindfulness in the moment, but I think the key of relaxed awareness is that juxtaposition between staying calm and relaxed and releasing the tension within that moment, at the same time as remaining pretty alert and in the moment with someone. Because the examples that we talk about, the best moments of connection that you can have are when you're at ease.
Right.
If you're really stressed and your mind is flying all over the place, or your body is tense, you're not going to be able to connect as well with that person in that moment. And sometimes we resonate with each other and just feed off of each other too. So that energy can exacerbate connection.
Sure.
So we start with that relaxed awareness, and then building off of that, we help readers sort of understand this idea of whole body listening, of not just listening to the words that someone is saying, but really listening and resonating with all of the information that they're giving to you non-verbally. Maybe their tone of their voice, the cadence of their speech, how fast they're speaking, how intense their voice might be, or their body language. And so all of that, I think, the more calm and relaxed you are, the more in tune you are and aware you are of the situation, the more you'll be able to read from that other person. And sometimes, like I was saying, we sort of resonate with them in that way. The exercises, Ted, too, that he was mentioning, we tried to break down different ones that we could use to strengthen each different component. So starting with kind of simple solo exercises, building up to things that you can do with people. Because overall, the goal for us was to help you take these exercises off the yoga mat, so to say, or outside of your room, and use them in life, in your dynamic interactions and conversations.
I think is huge, because I think even though you started this based on sort of research working with adults with autism, as you were saying, Ted, I think all of us can benefit from this, right? Like we all have moments where we need to be reminded, like, just take a deep breath, pay attention to what's going on around you. Don't be thinking about the 900 other things you have on your to-do list today. And so I think that's insanely beneficial. And I'm sorry, Ashley, I did not mean to interrupt you. Go ahead and finish the pillars.
Yeah, that's totally right. And I think the hardest part, at least for me sometimes, is just noticing that, like noticing that my mind is on that long to-do list or not with the person. So building that awareness initially, I think I encourage people to have a lot of compassion for themselves. I think sometimes when you're working on these, you start to realize, oh my God, I don't pay attention to anyone. I'm not in any moment with people. And it's, you start small and you build up towards it. But yeah, the last 2 pillars briefly are, we call them understanding and mutual responsiveness. So understanding, again, sounds pretty simple, like listening, but we sort of think of understanding as keeping in mind both, an understanding of what the other person is delivering to you, and also how you're filtering that information, because you're not going to be totally objective in how you interpret what they're saying to you. So thinking about your own biases or experiences that might be, maybe triggering you in some ways, which then makes it difficult to interpret that information accurately or as that person is trying to give to you. And then the last one, mutual responsiveness, is sort of, what do you do then? How do you respond in that moment? How do you take in all of that information that you've just received, and sort of stay in the flow of that conversation? I think part of it, there's a lot of different parts of mutual responsiveness, but I think some of the main elements are really trying to respond to what the other person is actually saying, rather than what you may have prepared or what you were trying to communicate to them. So really staying on target with them, meeting them where they are. Sometimes we have a discussion with someone and, we have a hard time maybe holding space for them instead of bringing our own stories or histories to the conversation. Or maybe it'll help someone else open up if you meet them where they are.
Right.
It's sort of, I guess one of the big themes too is that across all these pillars of attunement, right? You can strengthen, you can work on them, but you're going to fall out of step at some point. Everyone is going to fall out of attunement. There's no way our goal is to reach this perfect level of connection with everyone all the time. There's no need, and it's not possible. Finding those moments of realizing when it's happening and then trying again and getting back in there.
And I think that's such a great overall lesson for people, because I don't know if COVID has made this better or worse, but I think we do strive for perfection in every aspect of everything that we do. And it's such a struggle to realize you're human and you're going to fall down. You're going to make mistakes. And accept that, because we are so harshly judgmental of ourselves and then sometimes also of the people around us. So I think that's a fabulous thing for people to take away is it's okay because it's going to happen. But when it does happen, just try to be present with it. And then remember the different things that you can do, whether they be simple things like making eye contact, which I know when I first started this whole COVID Zoom world, I was so thrown off with the where do I look? Do I look directly in the camera? Well, that now seems creepy. Do I look at people in their little pictures? Because that doesn't seem appropriate either. And so we're constantly navigating this world of change and figuring out how to do that, but being okay with the fact that we're going to fail sometimes when we do that, I think is super important.
Yeah, and we were sort of briefly talking about how, the transition back to the real world and back to a life where we are interacting with people in public, we're not wearing masks. That's going to be a whole new thing of learning. I think people have made jokes about it, how they could have whatever facial expression behind their masks and it wouldn't matter. And now sort of starting to reuse those muscles. And that's also, I think one of the core tenets is that attunement is built up of all these skills that you can strengthen just like a muscle over time.
I love that. I love that it's a muscle that we can continue to work on, because I think a lot of times we get to a certain place in our life and we kind of feel like we should have this all together and we should know it all. And it's, it should just be there because, we're adults and we're living in this world. And I think there are so many different aspects of relationships, of building the human experience that require us to continually be building those muscles. So yes, I love that. And I'm going to put a little placard up for myself to remind myself of such a thing. Can you guys talk a little bit about sort of when you finished this book, I'm sure because of the research that you put in and sort of what you both have chosen to do in your respective fields, how this has changed how you build relationships and connections with people based on all of the information that you gathered?
Yeah, I think one of the things I love about the book and working on the book with Ashley is that I really feel like it's medicine that I want to take for myself too. It's not just not prescribing it for someone else. So I really use this regularly. I use what we talked about, and in different kinds of settings. It could be in a more personal setting or family setting, or at work. If I'm going to be meeting someone new that I'm nervous about or something like that, I will consciously sort of in a brief way say to myself some of the pillars that Ashley just mentioned, especially relax, aware, listen, just start with that, and then it can just sort of put me in a frame of mind and body that I'm not getting so caught up in my own worries or my own agenda or what I wanted to get across or what I'm hoping is going to come out of this. And I'm just in a frame of mind and body where I'm better able to connect. And then I think that if we can do that, then that's really where you want to start, because rather than focusing too much on the results and what's going to happen and what they're going to say and what you're going to say, just starting with finding a point of connection and keeping that back and forth going, it's been really helpful to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely feel the same way. I mean, I'd say the other thing that's kind of silly is that now all my friends and family, if I'm not paying attention, will really point it out. So that's definitely a reminder for me, but also it's nice to have a framework and language to use of trying to figure out what piece of this connection is not feeling right.
Yeah, Sorry, I just wanted to jump in and say that I really like what both of you guys were talking about not putting a burden on yourself to be perfect. And when Ashley just said that about her friends and family, kind of kidding her if she's, is less than perfect. I completely agree with what you guys were saying. It's impossible to be perfect. I don't know that you'd want to be perfect even. It's like kind of strange to be perfect. And but the point that we were trying to make is that even just even if you're a little bit better at it, nowhere near perfection, but even if you focus on this a little bit more, it could really have a big positive impact in your life and your relationships. So
often you connect better when you bring that vulnerability to a conversation. So often imperfection.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And I think because we can relate at that level of, you're not perfect and neither am I, and we're going to mess up and we're going to, have the days when we don't know where to look on the Zoom call or whatever it happens to be. I think absolutely that makes it easier for us, not necessarily to just relate to each other, but easier for us to communicate, because now I don't feel as a human being like I have to present in this perfect way and be this perfect person. And even though your family, sort of jokingly says something to you, Ashley, I kind of feel like that's a little bit of magic, because it is a reminder for you, or if it was happening to me or Ted, like it's this reminder of, that's right, I'm not perfect and I don't have to be because no one else is. But also just this little bit of, they're paying attention to what you're doing in the world and they know sort of what you've put out there and the research and I think that's amazing, because coming from the family that I come from, there are no academics. Nobody has gone to post-secondary school except for myself. So this would be like way over everybody's head. So I kind of love that your family is just like, hey, remember.
Oh yeah. They really remind me where I came from.
That's adorable. So you guys obviously worked on this research, and now you're in different places because Ashley, you're working on your program, and Ted, I assume moved on to something else, but I shouldn't make that assumption. So if you guys can talk about it, what exactly are you working on now in relation to sort of where you're doing your research and what's going on?
I continue to work on similar themes in the same place in Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania. I'm still working with adults on the autism spectrum. It's, research is really slow. It can be slow, and it's this gradual process of developing over time. Ashley and I developed this intervention and piloted it, and now we're doing a little bit larger trial. And so we're trying to build a kind of evidence base for that. But I have to say, the experience of writing the book was like a little bit of it just provided a new perspective. It's a new kind of writing for me. It's not like the pure academic research,
Sure.
Scientific report kind of writing. It's more like writing for the general public. And also it allows you to take off your blinders where you're so narrowly focused on very specific academic question and get the bigger picture. And I feel like it's really enriched my research, enriched my life, and just given me a sort of fresh take, almost like a fresh vocabulary for talking about the research. So
that's amazing. And Ashley, before you fill us in on where you are, I cannot imagine sort of what the process has been like over the last year and a half, because you both do research to figure out sort of how to navigate this weird COVID world that we live in while still doing research and teaching classes and being in the academic space. Because I know the academic space a little bit based on my undergrad, but I know it way pre-COVID. So Ted, do you want to talk just briefly about sort of how that's all changed for you? And then Ashley, I'll let you fill us in on sort of what you're doing as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think COVID was a wild ride in terms of, especially those first few months when it first hit, of like, suddenly we're all staying at home. We've got to figure out how are we going to do this from home, the teaching, the research, running a research team, the clinical work that I do. And so, yeah, and then as a physician myself, in the early months, when did COVID really hit? Like March or April of 2020. And then it really got bad in New York that spring. And people in Philadelphia were worried that, what happened in New York City was going to come to Philadelphia. And so they were building field hospitals and preparing and getting ready to redeploy physicians like me to who knows what, something having to do with COVID care. So there was so much uncertainty and so much anxiety and so on that it was something. And I have 2 kids, so they were home from school. So I think that I'm glad we wrote the book before this. I think some of the tools in the book, I mean, one of the things that Ashley and I have talked about is the whole principle of relaxed awareness is huge. Like, we can talk through those 4 pillars pretty quickly, but you could spend a long time on any one of them. And I think the COVID experience was kind of like a maximal workout for our relaxed awareness skills.
Sure.
Like how do we stay aware and alert to what's really going on around us, what's going on in the world, which is always changing and often anxiety provoking, while not feeling completely overwhelmed and, just panicked. So yeah, that was a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. It was very similar for me in terms of that transition. I mean, I think we might be so used to it in some ways now, but at the time it was so challenging to figure out how to start teaching classes online. And, I was working in clinics. And so at that time, we just totally shut down and tried to figure out how to provide therapy over Zoom. It was sort of a growing field already, but now it's just ramped up to really trying to figure out the logistics of it. And in some ways, I think patients enjoy it because it's more accessible to them. In terms of research, I've pivoted a little bit to working on more research related to kids and youth and strengthening resilience skills, which feels very related, especially because the way that we sort of define resilience is similar to attunement, where it encompasses many different skills. It's, your ability to be flexible, adapt to hardship situations, but not necessarily just, huge events like COVID, but also just daily hardships or challenges that you might have. And so we were providing a treatment in schools for kids, group therapy for strengthening those resilience skills. And, as much as I feel like that would be a really strong source of support for kids during this last year, it's just been really tough for families to navigate where they're putting their priorities. If their kids are on Zoom for 8 hours, to go on another Zoom session for a group therapy, it's hard to balance. So it's been tough from the research side, but at the same time, prioritizing patient care is obviously more important.
Right. And going forward, because fingers crossed at some point we'll be past the deep level of COVID that we've sort of been experiencing. Are you guys hoping to take the research from the book and sort of the book itself and the program that has developed from that and make it sort of a national program? What are your hopes for all of that?
I'm not even describing that. Yeah. We would love to.
Yeah, we would love to. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead and then I'll say something.
We were sort of talking about that recently, that idea of how do we expand it in different ways. I think the one thing with this book is that it touches on so many different industries and sort of fields. I think we've gotten a lot of community members have resonated with it, like just families, but also people in kind of the business world and industry in terms of strengthening those skills across leadership and across team building. I'm sort of, biased towards the idea of implementing this at a much larger scale for youth and for adolescents, especially to be able to develop these skills early on. And, we sort of think of them as something you can develop a muscle memory for. And to do that early feels like it would be magical.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I think it's really especially important for youth, because I think the young generation now, every generation faces its challenges, but I feel like young people today face a lot of challenges, societal, ecological, all kinds of things are happening. And I think there can be a tendency, almost analogous to COVID, that when you're faced with really difficult challenges, that it can sort of pull you apart, separate you, make you feel disconnected, alienated, alone. And so I think that these skills of connecting and attunement and understanding each other and working together and valuing relationships is going to be especially important for this younger generation. And in terms of a national program, that's very much, I feel like our goal is to, we've written the book, and how do we spread the word and disseminate this and make it as useful as possible to as many different people as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think is so useful, not just in the area where you did the research, as we've sort of been chatting about. I think, university students, high school students, parents, single parents, 2-parent households, entrepreneurs. I think there's something in this book for everyone, because if nothing else, it gives people the reminder, even though we live in this weird technology world now where we're sort of like super connected because of technology, we're actually even more disconnected because of technology than we've ever been before. And so it's kind of, well, for me anyway, it was kind of this reminder of like being present consistently and paying attention to the people who you're in the room with, whether, it's been 24 hours that I've been in the room with them, or whether it's somebody I'm meeting for the first time. And as I was saying to Ashley when we first started, before we started recording, we're here in Southern Ontario, just coming out of about 15 months worth of solid lockdowns. And there's this weird sort of dichotomy of like, do I meet people at the coffee shop, and what does that look like, and how does it feel, and how do I get back into that mindset of building those in-person relationships and being present and paying attention to, those nonverbal skills and everything else. So I think everyone who reads this book can take something from it, regardless of sort of the position that they're in life.
Thank you. Yeah, we hope so. We definitely hope so.
So I do want to be respectful of your time. And typically I will end the podcast by asking some questions, but rather than asking specific questions to you both, I wondered if you would be willing to share what your personal thoughts on connection are, based on the fact that you guys have sort of lived in this world of research about connections, why they matter, how they're important, how we build them. Sort of, if you wanted to take a few minutes to talk about your personal opinions, views, all of that.
Sure, absolutely. I think one thing for me that comes to mind is that, as we talked about, a lot of people universally have been having challenges with connection, whether it's more intense clinical levels of loneliness and depression, or just generally not being able to see their loved ones, losing touch, feeling disconnected, especially with the forms of media and social media and texting and all of those forms of technology that are sort of getting in the way of genuine, solid, just one-on-one in-person connection beyond the pandemic itself. And so because of that, I feel like everyone is craving it in some way and to some level. And it can feel really overwhelming to feel like, how am I ever going to get back there? Sort of like you just described, as you transition back into the real world, what is that going to look like? How do I get to where I was? Can I even get to where we used to be? And so with those feelings, it's just sort of a nice reminder for people to remember that small steps is where we start, and just, one step at a time, one sort of step towards that goal is very meaningful. It doesn't have to go right back to the way things were or used to be. And maybe it doesn't need to, or maybe it's not supposed to. But just kind of inching towards it, either whether it's as small as just taking that deep breath before you log into your next Zoom meeting and being able to be mindful on that, or taking that deep breath as you sort of go on a solo walk alone outside. May not even have to do with other people, but just those small steps add up. And I think sometimes we underestimate how important that is to actually move towards what we're hoping for.
Yeah. And I think one thing that Ashley said, I think about, getting back to where we were, or maybe we don't want to get back to exactly where we were. I was thinking, as difficult as COVID's been in this period of separation, that maybe there's a little bit of a silver lining in that period of separation, and that it throws things into perspective for us. We kind of see how important being with other people is to us when we can't have that. And it's maybe a chance to start again and work on some of those connections, because they probably weren't maybe as good as we wanted them to be even before COVID.
Right.
So it's sort of like, I used to play music, and there was this term like woodshedding, where you would kind of like, hang out by yourself and practice really hard and get good before you went back into the group to play again. So it's sort of like, it's a little bit of a woodshedding period that we can do some work on ourselves. I mean, some of the exercises we propose in the book are individual things you can do by yourself, or maybe with one other person as like a partner exercise. And so kind of working on some of those things so that when we do reconnect, we can reconnect better, hopefully.
Fingers crossed. And I actually, as you both have been talking, I kind of feel like, for me personally, getting back to what it was before is not what my goal is, because some of those relationships really weren't deep and meaningful connections. And I want more of that deep and meaningful connection. I want something different going forward, maybe, structured differently, but something that just feels like an actual, like soul to soul kind of connection. And I think hopefully, based on how everyone is talking, I think that's kind of what a lot of us are craving. So I thank you both for your time today. For everyone listening, the book is called Missing Each Other: How to Cultivate Meaningful Connections. I will put links to Ashley and Ted's social media, as well as to the book, in the show notes. And I appreciate both of your time today. Thank you so much for joining on the podcast. I am absolutely in awe of the research you guys have done. And I think this book is going to change people in such a meaningful way. So thank you for putting it out there in the world.
Oh, thank you so much for your time. It's really a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's really lovely. We really appreciate that. And we appreciate being on.
Well, thank you for coming on. A huge thank you to those who have listened to this podcast, and to Dr. Brodkin, Ted, and Ashley for joining me today. Go out and get a copy of the book. As I said, I will include in the show notes all of the links so that you can find the book. The book is called Missing Each Other: How to Cultivate Meaningful Connections. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. I hope you have an amazing week. Thank you, Dr. Brodkin, Ted, and Ashley for joining me today. And I will chat with you guys next week. Bye for now.